It's the night of April 6, 1862, and for Ulysses S. Grant, it's been a bad day. The army that he commands was blindsided by a massive enemy attack that drove his forces to the brink of annihilation. Chaos and disorder reigned supreme, and the enemy seemed poised to finish them off come morning. In spite of the day's catastrophe, he was calm and assured. When one of his subordinates asked him if he planned to retreat, he quickly retorted, "Not beaten yet, not by a darn sight." Much has been said about the generalship of Ulysses S. Grant, his strategic mind, his inter-branch cooperation, and his knack for utilizing logistics. But today I want to focus on something else: his unwavering resolve to fight, to win, and to never give up. His dogged determination to triumph over adversity, no matter how difficult. It was that determination that turned the tide of countless battles, and is what many historians remark as one of his most defining traits. But how did it come to be? What gave him the strength to keep going, no matter what? And what can we learn from him? Better start from the beginning. Grant was born in April 1822 in Ohio. His parents were tanners, but little Grant did not want to partake in the family business. So he enrolled at West Point, where he earned his bachelor's and a commission as an infantry officer in the United States Army. His first post was in St. Louis, Missouri, and it just so happened that the family of his West Point roommate lived there too, the Dent family. They owned a plantation and coerced the labor of up to 30 enslaved people. In spite of Grant's abolitionist upbringing, he quickly took a liking to Julia Dent, his roommate's sister, and the two quickly got hitched. Though before they could be wed, Grant got orders to go fight in the Mexican-American War in 1846. He detested the war as unjust and imperialist, but he still fulfilled his duty. It was there that he led men into combat and experienced the sting of battle for the first time, demonstrating meritorious courage and organizational prowess that would pay dividends later in life. Though all the medals in the world would have been no consolation, as above all he wanted to be with his family again. After the war, he had but little time to spend with his new family, for his orders kept him in increasingly remote postings to which his family could not accompany him. By 1853, he had had enough, and resigned his commission. He was content never to wear the uniform again, and hoped to find work near the home of his wife's family. However, Grant's military acumen did not translate to the labor market. Gainful employment proved elusive, and what jobs he could find were unfulfilling and unprofitable. He loved his family, cherishing his wife and his 4 children, but the financial strain left him anxious and increasingly unsettled. The addition of being given an enslaved person of his own did not help matters. Everything he seemed to do, he seemed to fail at. His talents, namely horsemanship and mathematics, were not able to put food on the table. His life as a soldier proved unsustainable, and everything he had done since failed to improve his financial standing. Simply put, he couldn't make it work, and each loss weighed heavily on him, but he wouldn't give up. He couldn't, not while his family counted on him. So after every fall, he dusted himself off and got back up. I say all this because, in this era, this epoch of frustration and malaise, was where Grant found his unconquerable strength. The hardships hardened his resolve, and the love he had for his family inspired him to keep going. But by 1859, he was at the end of his rope. Still, he valued his principles more than his money, and he freed the enslaved man that he was given, a moral decision without monetary benefit. He and his family left St. Louis and eventually ended up in Galena, Illinois, where Grant found work at his father's tanning shop, no doubt expecting to toil away there until the end of his days. However, crisis would beget opportunity, and soon it would be up to him to hold the country together. In response to the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, 11 southern states seceded from the Union in an unapologetic bid to preserve the institution of slavery. The following April, the federal garrison at Fort Sumter were bombarded into submission, and the crisis had escalated into civil war. President Lincoln called for tens of thousands of volunteers to put down the rebellion, and Grant answered. He was recommissioned as a colonel of an infantry regiment, and returned to combat at the Battle of Belmont, a chaotic and indecisive affair, one that provided him with much needed experience. His next battles, though, would be anything but indecisive. He set his sights on the strategic riverine fortresses of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Securing these would be the first step in cleaving the Confederacy in two, and enabling the Union to use the rivers for its own ends. Fort Henry was largely abandoned due to flooding, but the over 10,000 rebels at Fort Donelson were determined to put up a fight. In February 1862, Grant surrounded the fort, bombarding it with heavy gunboats and harassing it with infantry, until the Confederates launched a desperate breakout attempt. Grant held firm, correctly assuming that this attack was a Hail Mary, and that if the enemy was prevented from escaping, they would have no choice but to surrender. He ordered his own attack on the fort itself, and eventually beat the enemy back on all fronts. The defeated Confederates began negotiating for a surrender, hoping for favorable terms. Grant was uncompromising, stating that, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." The rebels had no choice but to accept, and over 10,000 of their number were taken prisoner. The victory assured Union control over the Cumberland River and earned Grant a new nickname, Unconditional Surrender. A great victory was won, and the press was quick to celebrate the newly promoted Major General Grant. The next step in Grant's master plan was to capture the strategically important city of Corinth in Mississippi. In preparation, he gathered his troops at the banks of the Tennessee River at a place called Shiloh. Though unbeknownst to the Union, an equally strong Confederate force was gathering as well. At the outset of April 1862, they marched north, aiming to annihilate the Union Army once and for all. On the morning of April 6th, they collided in what would become the deadliest battle in American history up to that time. Union lines could not hold against the onslaught, and the retreat caused thousands of soldiers to flee behind the back lines. With their backs to the Tennessee River, Grant knew that the retreat had to stop, and soon, lest his army be destroyed entirely. So he rode out and restored order, sending stragglers back to the front, collecting reports from his frontline commanders, and above all reinforcing that the lines must hold until nightfall. After hours and hours of ferocious fighting, night did fall. And with it came an eerie silence. The lines had bent, but they did not break. In spite of it all, Grant was convinced that victory would be snatched from the jaws of defeat. For Union reinforcements were arriving during the night, all while gunboats pounded the Confederate lines, keeping them off balance. He used the nocturnal hours to plan a daring counterattack, reasoning that the rebels were just as exhausted and spent as his own troops, and that an unexpected attack would drive them from the field of battle. He was right, and come the next morning, the Confederates were driven from their positions and sent back the way they came, all the way back to Corinth. Grant's determination had won the day, but at a high price. More Americans perished in this battle than any other in American history thus far, and the nation was shocked both at the carnage and how the proud Union troops were caught so completely by surprise. The press pressed the blame on Grant, calling for his removal and worse. The vitriol almost drove him to resign, but his fellow officers convinced him to stay, none more so than William Tecumseh Sherman. The men under Grant's command were counting on him, and he would not give up on them in their time of need. However, his perseverance was also catching the attention of President Lincoln, who praised him for his willingness to fight. Union troops did eventually move to capture Corinth, though the rebel army slipped away unmolested. Grant quietly continued his command and prepared for his next campaign, one to take the vital city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. Capturing it would give the Union full control over the largest river in the nation, and effectively split the Confederacy in two. Leaders, both North and South, knew the importance of this city, and the rebels were determined to defend it, no matter the cost. Initial attacks met stiff resistance, and as 1863 dawned, the Union was still no closer to victory. Undeterred by these failures, Grant persisted with more unorthodox tactics, finally succeeding in approaching the city in the spring after a series of fierce battles. His boldness once again paying dividends, and his willingness to press the attack prevented him from being bogged down in stalemate. Though he could not prevent the onset of a siege after multiple failed attempts to breach the fortifications of the city. Continued bombardment on land and from the river continued to wear away at the defenders, but it was hunger that finally drove them to the negotiating table. A deal was brokered, and the garrison was permitted to retreat as Union forces took Vicksburg, and with it the entire Mississippi River. The day of victory was July 4th, Independence Day, and just one day after the Union victory at Gettysburg. With these strategic triumphs, the South was now living on borrowed time. But like a cornered animal, its ferocity did not diminish. With the victory at Vicksburg, Grant became a national celebrity, and his next victory only enhanced his growing reputation. He relieved and resupplied the starving Union troops at Chattanooga and rallied them to a decisive counterattack at Lookout Mountain in November 1863. It was becoming clear that Grant had a knack for salvaging seemingly unsalvable situations, and nowhere needed more salvaging than the Eastern Theater of War, where Robert E. Lee and his army still held sway over much of the eastern seaboard, including Old Virginia. President Lincoln needed a commander who would relentlessly pursue Lee and force him into submission, and he chose Grant for the job. In March of the new year, he was made commander of all Union armies and promoted to lieutenant general, the first since George Washington. The prosecution of the war now rested on Grant's shoulders, and he intended to bring the Confederacy to its knees. He ordered offensives all across the front, forcing the outnumbered Confederates to fight a war of attrition they had little chance of winning. He entrusted his subordinates to carry out attacks in the West, so that he could personally focus on the threat in the East. Grant knew that Lee was the toughest opponent he had yet faced, a bold and clever commander with an uncompromising willingness to fight, but he had a weakness. He did not anchor his operations towards strategic ends like Grant did. His great battles were tactically marvelous, but often strategically inconclusive, producing losses which were unsustainable. In a war of attrition, Lee would have no chance of victory. Grant knew this. And with an army of over 100,000 strong, he vowed to batter the enemy into submission, once and for all. surrender at Appomattox was a historic moment, and it was a great triumph for Grant. His relentless pursuit of Lee wore him and his army down until they could resist no longer. Thousands died to achieve this aim, but as Lee officially surrendered, it was shown that they had not died in vain. Grant's unyielding prosecution of the war hastened its end, thereby saving more lives. Grant, ever perceptive of strategic objectives, was willing to sustain tactical losses in order to keep the strategic momentum. His determination was what enabled him to do this. Throughout the war, other Union generals, when faced with similar situations, backed off and allowed the enemy to regroup and reorganize. But Grant kept up the attack and never lost sight of the big picture. It was because of that that General Lee surrendered his army to him at Appomattox Courthouse. In the surrender proceedings, Grant's terms were lenient and conciliatory. He paroled the enemy troops, allowing them to return home, never to fight again. While fighting in other theaters would continue for weeks afterwards, Lee's surrender was the final nail in the coffin for the Confederacy. The war was over, and the Union had been preserved, thanks in no small part to General Grant. His grand strategy ended the war, and above all, his resolve ensured that he had the will to carry it out. His life was filled with failure, but after each defeat, he got back up and learned from his mistakes. As E. Honda from Street Fighter VI once said, "Nobody ever got strong without losing. Don't lose hope." And that's today's lesson on Grant's generalship, that you just gotta dig deep and keep going, no matter what. Because in every battle, there comes a time when both sides consider themselves beaten. Then the one who continues the attack wins.